The morning Rosalind Ashford discovered the photograph, she was not looking for anything. That was the thing about betrayal. It never announced itself. It simply appeared, tucked between the pages of a ledger book she had pulled from the study shelf to press a flower she had found on the garden walk, a small purple aster that had no business blooming in October, but had done so anyway, indifferent to the season's opinion of it. The photograph was of a woman she did not recognize, young, laughing, leaning against the hood of a motor car with her dark hair loose around her shoulders. On the back in Nathaniel's handwriting, except no, not Nathaniel. Nathaniel was a name already spoken for. In her husband's handwriting. In Edmund's handwriting, except that name too was. She set the photograph face down on the desk. She pressed the aster between the pages of the ledger anyway. Then she closed the book, placed it back on the shelf in the exact position she had found it, and went downstairs to pour herself a cup of tea she did not drink. His name was Cornelius Ashford. He was 41 years old and she was 26, and they had been married for 3 years, and she had never once been foolish enough to call it a love match. That was what people in Rosalind's family said when they meant the opposite of love. A sensible arrangement. Her mother had said it while adjusting the collar of Rosalind's traveling coat at the train station in Halifax, the autumn before the wedding. The Ashfords are a sensible family, and this is a sensible arrangement, and you are a sensible girl. 3 times sensible, like a charm against regret. Cornelius was not unkind. This was the thing Rosalind always returned to when she tried to understand the architecture of her marriage. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, present in the house, present at the dinner table, present in the bed they shared twice a month with the efficiency of 2 people fulfilling an obligation neither had asked for, but absent in every way that made a person feel that they existed. He did not ask her opinion on things. He did not remember how she took her tea. He was not unkind. He simply did not see her, and Rosalind for 3 years had made her peace with being unseen. She had learned which rooms were hers and which were his. She had befriended the housekeeper, Mrs. Parrish, who was 70, and had opinions about everything, and talked to Rosalind as though she were a full human being, which was more than could be said for most of the Ashford social circle. She had planted a kitchen garden. She had written letters to her sister Dorothea in Fredericton every Sunday afternoon. She had, by careful and deliberate effort, built a life that fit inside the margins of the life she had been given. The photograph did not ruin this. That was what surprised her most. She stood in the kitchen with her untouched tea, and she turned the feeling over carefully, the way you would turn a stone to see what lived underneath. What she found was not as devastation. What she found was something quieter, and in its own way, more clarifying, a kind of cold acknowledgement. So there it was, the thing she had always suspected existed, somewhere in the distance of him. She drank her tea cold. She went upstairs and changed for dinner. The woman in the photograph was named Beatrice Claremont. And Rosalind did not learn this from Cornelius. She learned it because 2 weeks after finding the photograph, she wore her gray wool coat to the Ashford solicitor's office to retrieve a document Cornelius had asked her to collect. She was the one who managed correspondence and errands, this being one of the practical functions of a sensible wife. And the secretary, at the front desk, a young man with an unfortunate mustache, said without thinking, "Ah, is this for the Claremont matter?" Mr. Ashford mentioned, and then stopped himself, because Rosalind's face must have done something, though she could not have said what. "The conveyance document," Rosalind said. "For the Ashford property file." "Yes, of course. One moment." She stood in the reception and looked at a painting of a river that she would never be able to remember afterward, and when the young man returned with the envelope, she thanked him pleasantly, and walked out into the November cold and stood on the pavement for a moment before she kept walking. Beatrice Claremont. She said the name to herself twice, not with bitterness, but with the particular attentiveness of someone filing information away for later use. On the streetcar home she thought about Dorothea. Dorothea had married for love, a schoolteacher named Paul who taught geography and sang too loudly in church, and brought Dorothea wildflowers from the roadside ditch every Friday because he could not afford a florist. Their kitchen was cluttered, and their children were loud, and their house was always warm. Rosalind had stood at their wedding, and felt something she could not name exactly. Not envy, precisely. Something more like standing outside a lit window in winter, watching people who did not know they were warm. She had written to Dorothea every Sunday for 3 years, and she had never once mentioned the distance. She had described the house, the garden, the social calendar, the various opinions of Mrs. Parrish. She had not mentioned what it was like to share a house with someone who looked through her as though she were a pane of glass. She thought, on the streetcar, that she might mention it now. The letter she wrote that Sunday was 6 pages long. It was the longest letter she had ever written in her life. She did not tell Dorothea everything. She told her enough. She described the photograph and the conversation at the solicitor's office, and then she described what she understood her marriage to be, plainly and without ornamentation, the way you might describe a medical condition to a doctor. Here is what it is. Here is how long it has been this way. Here is what I have and have not told myself about it, she wrote. I am not certain what I am going to do. I am certain that I am not going to continue as though I have not seen what I have seen. I am not sure yet what the difference between those two things looks like. But I am tired. I did not realize until I started writing this that I have been tired for a very long time. She sealed the envelope and set it on the hall table, to be posted, and went to bed. Cornelius came home from his club at 11:30. She heard him in the hall below, the particular sequence of sounds: coat on the hook, the third stair that creaked, water in the bathroom basin. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a man who lived in the same house as her, and thought about the word tired, and found it accurate. He did not come to her room. He had not come to her room in 4 months. She had not thought about this consciously until now. It was the kind of thing that happened in the margins, that you did not examine too closely, because examination required you to have expectations, and expectations required you to have wanted something. Rosalind lay in the dark and, for the first time in 3 years, thought quite carefully about what she had wanted. Dorothea's reply came 11 days later, which was fast. Because Dorothea had written it the same evening, Rosalind's letter arrived and had posted it the next morning. Rosie, the letter began, which was what Dorothea called her, when she was worried. I have read your letter 3 times, and I want you to know that I am not going to tell you what to do, because you are the most sensible person I have ever known, and you will figure this out. But I am also going to tell you this. You deserve to be seen. That is not a complicated thing to deserve. That is the most basic thing, and if he cannot do it, that is a failure of his vision, not of your visibility. You are not a pane of glass, Rosie. You never were. You were always the whole window. She read it standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on, just in from the cold. She read it twice. Then she sat down, and she allowed herself, for approximately 10 minutes, to cry in a way she had not cried since the first week of her marriage, when she had understood what she had agreed to, and had told herself it was sensible, and had believed herself. After 10 minutes she stopped. She washed her face at the kitchen sink. She put the kettle on. She thought, what do I actually know? She made a list, mentally, with the precision of someone who had always found lists useful. She knew there was a woman named Beatrice Claremont, who was connected to a Cornelius Ashford matter at the solicitor's office. She knew there was a photograph of a young woman hidden in a ledger on the study shelf. She knew her husband had not visited her room in 4 months. She knew her husband had not asked her a personal question, a genuine question, not a logistical one, in longer than she could remember. What she did not know, whether the photograph was recent, whether Beatrice Claremont was the woman in it, whether it constituted what people meant when they used the word affair, or something older, something from before, a ghost of a previous life she had never been told about. She thought, it matters, and it also doesn't, because even if the photograph was from 20 years ago, even if Beatrice Claremont was a perfectly innocent solicitor's client, even if there was nothing at all except what there appeared to be, that would not change the fundamental truth of standing outside a lit window in winter and watching warmth you had no access to. She drank her tea. She thought, all right. What next? What next, as it turned out, was a Tuesday afternoon in December, when Rosalind went back to the solicitor's office, not to retrieve a document this time, but because she had made an appointment. The solicitor's name was Mr. Pemberton. He was a compact man with a gray beard, and the careful, non-committal expression of someone who had spent 40 years knowing things he was not at liberty to say. He shook her hand and offered her a chair and waited. I would like to understand my position, Rosalind said, with respect to the marriage, legally. Mr. Pemberton looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. She suspected he had been prepared for a question about household accounts or perhaps a will. Mrs. Ashford, he said, I should mention that Mr. Ashford is also a client of this firm, which means... I understand, Rosalind said. I am not asking you to act against your client. I am asking you to explain the law to me. That is a thing you are permitted to do. A pause. Then something that was almost, but not quite a smile. It is, he said. Yes. She left an hour later with a much clearer understanding of what she owned, what she did not own, what she was entitled to under the law, and what she would need if she ever wanted to change the terms of her situation. She also left with the name of a solicitor in a different firm who had no connection to Cornelius Ashford, and who had a reputation for being competent and discreet. She stood on the pavement in the December cold, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly, not relief. Something more like orientation. Like a compass finding north. Like knowing, for the first time in years, precisely where she was standing. She did not confront Cornelius. This was the decision she came to, and it was not a passive decision. It was the most deliberate choice she had made in years. Confrontation would require him to respond, and he would respond by minimizing, or explaining, or perhaps even apologizing in the way men apologized when they wanted you to stop asking questions, and none of those responses would give her anything useful. What Rosalind wanted was not an explanation. She had realized this slowly, over the December weeks, as the garden froze outside and Mrs. Parrish made shortbread, and the house went on in its usual quiet way. She did not want him to tell her the story of Beatrice Clairmont. She did not want him to defend himself or his behavior. She did not want particularly to know whether he felt guilty. What she wanted was to understand what her life could look like, what it could be, on its own terms, independent of whether Cornelius Ashford was the kind of husband she deserved. She had begun, quietly, to find out. She had her own money, not much, but some. A small inheritance from her grandmother that she had never touched because there had never seemed to be anything to use it for. She had met twice with the solicitor Mr. Pemberton had referred her to, a brisk woman named Miss Hargreaves, who wore practical shoes and did not waste time on sentiment. She had begun to understand what was hers and what could be made hers, and what the process looked like if she decided she wanted a process. She had also, for the first time, begun to pay attention to herself. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. For 3 years she had moved through her days as a function of the household, managing, arranging, attending, maintaining. She had done it competently and without complaint, because this was what she had agreed to, and Rosalind was a person who honored her agreements. But somewhere in the process, she had stopped noticing what she herself thought, wanted, preferred, felt. She had been so busy being invisible that she had invisibilized herself. Now she noticed. She noticed that she genuinely enjoyed the kitchen garden, not just as a project but as a place. The smell of the earth, the particular satisfaction of something growing, because she had helped it grow. She noticed that she liked reading history, not the social histories Cornelius left on the parlor table, but military history, logistics and strategy, the accounts of people who had planned things carefully under conditions of significant uncertainty. She noticed that she was good at numbers, that she had always been good at numbers, and that she had been doing Cornelius's household accounts for 3 years, with a level of precision that would have made a bank clerk envious. She wrote these things down in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She was not sure yet what she would do with them, but she wrote them down. In January Cornelius came to her. Not to her room. To the parlor on a Sunday evening when she was reading, which was already unusual. She could not remember the last time he had sought her out without a logistical purpose. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in, which was even more unusual, and she set down her book and waited. He sat across from her. He looked, she thought, as though he had rehearsed this, and was trying to remember his lines. "I have been thinking," he said, "that perhaps we have not been as..." He stopped, started again. "That there is perhaps a distance between us that I have not adequately." He stopped again. Rosalind watched him and felt something that she would later describe to Dorothea as the particular sadness of watching someone try very hard to do something they have never practiced. She did not feel anger in that moment. She felt strangely, almost sorry for him. "Cornelius," she said, "what would you like to say?" He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something that she had not expected to see in his face. Something that looked, almost, like the face of a man who was lost. "I don't know," he said, and this, unlike everything else he had said, sounded entirely true. "All right," she said, "I'm not." He looked at his hands. "I understand that this has not been what you were hoping for." "What were you hoping for?" she asked. Not unkindly. Genuinely, the question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for long enough that the clock on the mantel ticked through a full minute. "I don't know," he said again. "Then I think," Rosalind said, "that we have the same problem." She picked up her book. She did not read it. She looked at the page without seeing it, but she held it in her hands. And after a while Cornelius stood up and left the room. And she heard his footsteps go down the hall toward his study, and the house went quiet again, in the way it always did. The spring came. The garden came back to life in the slow, stubborn way of things that have survived a winter. Rosalind had a conversation with Miss Hargreaves that she had been preparing for since December. Afterward, she sat in Miss Hargreaves's waiting room for a few minutes before standing up and going out into the March air, which was cold and smelled like thaw, like soil and snow and something on its way to becoming something else. She had not made a final decision. She wanted to be accurate about this. She was a person who did not make final decisions until she understood all of the available information, and there was still information she was gathering. But she had a very clear picture, now, of what her choices were. She could see them laid out in front of her like a map, the terrain understood, even if the route was not yet chosen. She walked home. It took 40 minutes, and she did not take the streetcar. When she arrived, Mrs. Parrish was in the kitchen with shortbread again. Mrs. Parrish's response to uncertainty was apparently to bake, and she looked at Rosalind with the particular assessment of a woman who had spent 7 decades reading people, and said, "Sit down and have some tea, Mrs. Ashford. You look like a person who has just thought something very important." "I think I have," Rosalind said. "Good," said Mrs. Parrish. "It's about time." What happened next was not dramatic. This was, Rosalind later thought, the thing about real life. The important moments rarely looked important from the outside. There was no confrontation scene. There was no thrown crockery. There was no moment of operatic weeping or shouting. There was only a conversation, in the parlor, on a Tuesday evening in April, that she had written out in her notebook 3 times, and then thrown away the notes because she had finally understood what she actually wanted to say. Cornelius listened. She said what she had to say clearly and without anger, because she was not angry. She had been, months ago, but anger required a certain kind of hope underneath it. The hope that if you expressed the feeling strongly enough the other person would understand and change. And she had stopped hoping for that somewhere around February. What she said was this. She was leaving. Not in a way that was punitive or retaliatory. Not because she had uncovered evidence of anything, though she had, and he could see on her face that she had, and he did not deny it. She was leaving because she had realized something that she should perhaps have understood before she married him, which was that invisibility was not a sustainable way to live. She had tried to make her peace with it. She had managed it for 3 years. She could not manage it anymore. He said, and this was the thing she had not predicted, the thing that she would think about for years afterward. "I know." She looked at him. "I have known for some time," he said, "that I was not." He stopped. His hands were on his knees and he was looking at them. "That I have not been what I should have been. I have thought about how to fix it, and I have not known how. I don't know if I know how." She thought about the Sunday evening in January, the man who looked like someone lost. "I think," she said carefully, "that it requires wanting to, and I'm not sure either of us wants the same thing anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "perhaps not." The conversation ended. The marriage did not end that night. These things took time, involved paperwork, required the calm and capable presence of Miss Hargreaves, and a great deal of correspondence. But in all the ways that mattered, it ended in that room in April, on a Tuesday evening, with a man looking at his hands and a woman looking at him clearly for the first time. She moved to a small house in the west end of the city in June. It had a garden, which she had insisted on, and a kitchen that was entirely hers, and 2 spare rooms that she had no plan for yet but which she thought might be for guests, or perhaps eventually for a small income. She had ideas about this, several ideas, organized neatly in the notebook she still carried in her coat pocket. Dorothea came to visit in July. She came on the train from Fredericton with her youngest, a girl of 4 who had strong opinions about everything, and called Rosalind Aunt Rosie with great authority, and she stood in the kitchen doorway while Rosalind made tea and looked around at the small particular rooms of the small particular house and said, "Oh, Rosie, this is yours." "It is," Rosalind said. "It suits you." "I think it does." She handed Dorothea a cup. "I think a great many things suit me that I simply hadn't got around to finding out." They sat at the kitchen table, and the 4-year-old investigated the lower shelves with the seriousness of a scholar, and outside the garden was coming into summer. The kitchen garden Rosalind had planted in May that was already overcoming its beds with a kind of cheerful ambition. The aster she had pressed in October, she had moved it to a different book, one that was genuinely hers, was somewhere in the parlor bookshelf, dry and flat and purple-brown and still, somehow, itself. Rosalind drank her tea hot. She had always preferred it that way. She was only now getting used to drinking it that way, because she was only now in the habit of making it to suit herself. She did not think about Cornelius often. When she did, she thought of him without bitterness and without much warmth. A fact of a previous chapter, like a house you had lived in and moved away from, and could describe accurately without wanting to return to. She did not know what had become of Beatrice Clairmont, and she found she did not need to know. That story had never been hers to tell. Her story was here, this kitchen, this garden. The notebook in her coat pocket with its running list of things she was discovering she wanted. The 4-year-old on the floor who had found a wooden spoon and was conducting an experiment with it. Dorothea across the table, watching her with the particular expression of someone who had been worried for years and had recently gradually stopped. "You seem different," Dorothea said. "I am," Rosalind said. "When did that happen?" Rosalind thought about October, a purple aster that had no business blooming but had done so anyway, indifferent to the season's opinion of it. "It was already happening," she said. "I just hadn't noticed yet."